With the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, the country took a hard right turn. For decades, labor unions were an accepted part of the nation's economic fabric, but a transformation was coming. One of the unions formed as a result of President Kennedy's executive order allowing unions for federal workers was Patco. In the 1980 election, this union endorsed Reagan. During the first year of his presidency, Patco declared a strike and expected Reagan's support, but quickly learned otherwise. While the union did have a serious issue with understaffing and stress, the strike was a violation of federal law, and Reagan ordered the union to end the strike or he would fire the strikers. About 10% of the controllers went back to work, but the rest refused. The government had made an offer of significant pay increases, but the controllers thought they could get much more. Reagan fired all those who did not return and barred them from working for the federal government for life. It took years to bring the number of trained controllers back to normal levels, but the government managed to muddle through. Patco had badly misjudged the circumstances, especially lack of public support for the strike. The union was decertified in October of 1981. UAW leadership had argued that the concessions given to Chrysler in the bailout in 1980 were only a temporary fix to help save the company, but Chrysler labor costs were now $3 an hour below those of Ford and GM. In the midst of a recession and layoffs, by the end of 1982, the UAW had also granted Ford and GM huge contract concessions. The levee was breached. More and more corporations were moving manufacturing outside the United States, downsizing or closing their U.S. facilities, and thus weakening their union's negotiating strength. In this climate, corporations throughout the nation sought and received contract concessions, and in some cases, pursued strategies to get rid of their unions entirely. A heroic strike against the Phelps Dodge copper mining company in Texas and Arizona in 1983 and 84 was broken through the use of replacement workers, violent clashes between strikers and Arizona State Police, and eventually a union decertification election in which the strikers, by law, were not allowed to vote. In 1986, the steelworkers engaged USX, formerly U.S. Steel, in a 6-month struggle, 2 months longer than the big successful strike in 1959. But things were much different now. In 1959, the steelworkers struck the whole industry and shut down 90% of the country's production. In 1986, they took on USX by itself after having already granted concessions to several of its smaller competitors. Imports had become a major factor, and USX had become a conglomerate, able to maintain income from its non-steel enterprises during the strike. In the end, while the union was able to achieve some language against subcontracting, some guarantees of investments in the American steel industry, and lesser concessions than the company demanded, it nevertheless was forced to agree to wage and benefit concessions worth $2.45 an hour and the loss of 1,350 union jobs. The old strategies no longer worked now that management was prepared to permanently replace strikers and wait out the union. New tactics were needed, but top union leadership was slow to adapt. Local-level union leaders were quicker to grasp the new reality. The best example is the strike of Local P9 in Austin, Minnesota, against the Hormel meatpacking company. The union had agreed to concessions in 1978 in exchange for the company's agreement to construct a new modern plant in Austin. But when the company sought additional concessions in 1985, the workers struck. The local union had seen this confrontation coming and had begun strike preparations nearly a year in advance. With innovative road warriors taking their cause throughout the country in a creative program called Adopt a Striking Hormel Family, P9's struggle generated national involvement. All told, some 3,000 labor organizations lent their support in one form or another. Unfortunately, the national union feared a decertification election and undercut P9, accepting a contract that retained all the replacement workers. Lack of support from the parent organization undermined the creative tactics of the local union. The United Mine Workers demonstrated that these creative strategies could be effective when the whole union was committed to success. Its 1989 strike against the Pittston Company borrowed nonviolent civil disobedience tactics from the civil rights movement, including the takeover of a processing plant for 4 days. Road warriors took the struggle throughout the country, and thousands of union activists visited the union's Camp Solidarity. The miners' victory preserved health benefits for retirees, widows, and disabled miners. However, the devastation of the 1980s was dramatic. Unions entered the 1990s as only 15.5% of the workforce, and about a third of that was in the public sector. The most vigorous battle of the mid-1990s was fought when the A.E. Staley Company locked out its union of about 700 members. Located in Decatur, Illinois, this company was owned by a British conglomerate that sought serious concessions from the union, the most onerous being rotating 12-hour shifts. The union fought gallantly, using tactics learned from the Hormel and Pittston strikes, but the national union provided only lukewarm support. After 30 months of struggle, a surrender faction within the local union won control, and the national union forced a vote on a concessionary contract and an end to the lockout. An example of a more successful struggle was the 2-week nationwide strike by the Teamsters in 1997 against United Parcel Service, UPS. Under the leadership of recently elected reformer Ron Carey, solid preparation resulted in an effective strike that produced an agreement to convert 10,000 part-time jobs into full-time jobs. Realizing it was time for a change in leadership, in 1995, many unions supported candidates running against the incumbent AFL-CIO administration that had been in charge since the merger of 1955. The insurgents were successful, electing John Sweeney as president, Rich Trumka as secretary-treasurer, and Linda Chavez Thompson to the newly created position of executive vice president. The new leadership incorporated innovative thinking and attempted many initiatives aimed at reviving the labor movement. But the constituent unions remained focused on their own interests, and the new approaches met with limited success. Labor entered the new century quite weakened. Overall union membership was down to 13.4% of the workforce, and nearly 45% of that was in the public sector. Union negotiations now often consisted of trying to fend off employer demands for two-tier wage systems and for cuts in wages and benefits. The 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center caused a period of economic stress, and the Great Recession that began in 2007 led to the loss of 500,000 union jobs in manufacturing. In the auto industry, the government bailout of GM and Chrysler included further massive concessions. In 2010, another hard right turn in U.S. politics at the state level saw once heavily unionized Midwestern states wage an unprecedented war on public sector unions. Newly elected Republican governors, with large legislative majorities, passed legislation that gutted the legal structures under which public sector workers had organized and bargained contracts. In Wisconsin, Governor Walker's legislation wiped out years of benefit gains and decreed that public sector unions could only negotiate wages, not benefits or work rules. Labor's response was a 3-week occupation of the state capitol building and as many as 150,000 protesters attending rallies. But Walker had the votes and forced through the changes. 4 years later, Walker furthered his attack on unions by signing a right-to-work bill impacting private sector unions. After the steady expansion of union membership in the 1940s and 1950s, there has been a steep decline in the percentage of the workforce in unions. By 2010, only about 11% of workers were unionized. That decline in union membership has been accompanied by a drop in the share of income by American workers and the American middle class, and the lack of collective bargaining power is certainly a major contributor to growing income inequality. With all the problems unions face, there is still good news. Even as public employee unionism was under attack throughout the Midwest, the Chicago Teachers Union challenged this trend with a 7-day strike in September 2012. Months of preparation resulted in heavy membership involvement and support from most parents and neighborhood associations. The union fought against school closures and privatization, high-stakes testing, and overcrowded classrooms. The eventual settlement was a partial victory for the union that included pay raises, changes to teacher evaluations, and a better system for rehiring laid-off teachers. During the 2010 recession, the union at the Kohler bathroom fixtures plant in Kohler, Wisconsin, was forced to accept a 5-year wage freeze in a 2-tier system that left new hires with very low pay and little in benefits. In November of 2015, 94% of the workforce voted to strike for our kids and grandkids. With strong support from the national union and the local community, the workers were able to substantially close the pay and benefits gap and achieve pay raises for everyone. This time the strike only lasted a little over a month. Since the early days of our country, working people have struggled and sacrificed to gain the right to form unions. These early organizers understood that without unions, they were nothing more than a commodity in the marketplace. The poverty and suffering of working families was viewed by many as natural and inevitable. Business and allied political forces resisted bitterly and sometimes violently. And it took decades, but unions changed the nature of employment and, in many ways, the nature of our society. While the influence of unions is being assailed and reduced in much of the country, history teaches us that workers will fight on and continue in their struggle to organize.